Good evening, Canton Church of Christ. Here we are again now in our fourth installment of our Wednesday night class, being done this way as opposed to face in person at the church building. I hope that the past 3 weeks have been profitable for you, as we talked about hope the first week, and we've spent 2 weeks on Ecclesiastes, and we will wrap Ecclesiastes up this evening. Then we'll see kind of where we go moving forward after this. But before we get into the book of Ecclesiastes in terms of our study, I'd like to give you a moment. We're going to have a word of prayer, and then I'm going to give you 2 or 3 seconds to pause if you would like and read either the whole book of Ecclesiastes again or chapter 8 and verse 1 through the end of the book, because that is the portion that we'll be focusing in on tonight. But let's begin with a word of prayer first. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for life. We thank you for carrying us through the trying times of our lives, and we ask that you help us always to see life as a trust from you, and that we will strive to walk in ways that are pleasing to you and live by your hand in our time under the sun. We ask that you be with those who are dealing with sickness or who have lost loved ones recently or in times past and may be grieving, struggling with that you give them peace, that you give them comfort. We ask that you be with us and help us to be there for each other at all times. We thank you for your Son Jesus and the hope that we have in him. It's in his name that we pray. Amen. So at this time, if you want to read chapters 8 through 12, you can pause the video and do so, and then resume when you're ready. Okay, so we are in Ecclesiastes chapter 8, but before we actually get into those last 4 chapters, let's just briefly review this book that talks about how everything under the sun, if lived under the sun without God, without a hope in God and a trust in God, is just empty. It's vain. The book defends a life that is lived by faith in God as compared to the alternatives, which are vain, empty, illogical, obscure. And while the book echoes ancient pessimism literature, it contrasts the perspective of that literature with the joy and assurance that are found in trusting God. From the first 3 chapters, we drew some conclusions that the only end of life without God is the pessimism that we see in ancient pessimism literature. The preacher sought purpose through various accomplishments, and he tells us that he sought purpose in human wisdom and knowledge. He sought joy and purpose through life's pleasures, sought purpose through culture and wealth, through hard work and toil. The conclusion was that life only has purpose and meaning if it is lived by the hand of God. And then last week we talked about chapters 4 through 7. We saw the many troubles that life under the sun has, and that those are not God's doing, but that he is the answer to them. The troubles are indeed man's doing, because man chooses not to live by the hand of God. And so we have a choice to make: life under the sun or life by the hand of a perfect and gracious God. And we ended with the thought and the encouragement that we resolve to serve and please him in complete reliance on his wisdom, on his love, and on his faithfulness. So now let's talk about the last 4 chapters of the book. We'll begin in chapter 8 and verse 1. And right here, we'll go through that introduction in just a moment, but give you a little overview. We'll look at authority, injustice, and faithfulness. We'll look at wisdom and foolishness. a call to choice again, and the little epilogue that we have at the end of the book. We begin with our introduction, in which we kind of have a transition. Verse 1 can kind of be seen as pulling from what we saw at the end of chapter 7. Chapter 8 and verse 1 says, "Who is like a wise man, and who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the sternness of his face is changed." And this comes on the heels of that discussion that man fails. The problems that we have in life are not God's fault. They're because of man's failures. And so here the question is, how can you tell a wise man? And the answer, in short, is that you can tell a wise man because he seeks God. And that's what pulls us back into the end of chapter 7, and we're actually going to see it moving forward as well. You can tell a wise man because he seeks to please God. There are a number of things about daily life that can be perturbing, and we can conjure up no good explanation for many of these things. But the individual that's living by the hand of God perseveres through these things. He or she presses on with life, determined to live and enjoy God's blessings. He or she remembers that the only way to a full life is to fear God and keep His commandments. This is all that remains for man. All else is vanity, emptiness, futility, a chasing or striving after the wind. So there's our introduction. Keep those things in mind as we move through these last 4 chapters and wrap up our study of Ecclesiastes. Authority, injustice, and faithfulness will be our first piece here in chapter 8 and verse 2 through chapter 9 and verse 10. We can see there in chapter 8, verses 2 through 8, the problem of royal authority. The king's advice there in verses 2 through 4, and some important concepts in verses 5 through 8. The first of these, at the beginning of verse 5, is the concept that the wise submit to authority. It's foolish to not submit to authority. Wisdom leads us to be submissive to authority. And then the rest of verse 5 through verse 7, the need for patience. Because he who keeps, picking up in verse 5, he who keeps his command will experience nothing harmful, speaking of a king, right? And a wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment. Because for every matter there's a time and judgment, though the misery of man increases greatly. For he does not know what will happen, so who can tell him when it will occur? There's a need for patience, a submission to authority, and then just, it is what it is, and let's move forward patiently. Because we don't know what's coming. We don't know what the result is. There's no one to tell us. We've got to leave those things in God's hands. We have all experienced situations that we thought were absolutely horrendous, but when we look back on them, we can see how that struggle was actually a blessing. And that should serve to remind us. See, there's a limit to man's authority in verse 8. We don't have the power. It's not up to us. And so even though we may have oppression from above, we must submit to authority and wait patiently, continuing to live by the hand of God. In verses 9 through 11, we have a discussion of life's injustices. The preacher tells us his experience in the first verse or two there, and then the lesson in verse 10, that it's vanity. The end of verse 10. It's still vanity. It's still emptiness. Life's injustices leave us feeling empty, but there is an explanation. The sentence against an evil work, verse 11, is not executed speedily. Therefore, The heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. But what's the contrast? See, this sets the stage for what's going to follow beginning in verse 12 because of the response of faith. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and his days are prolonged, yet I surely know that it will be well with those who fear God, who fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, nor will he prolong his days, which are as a shadow, because he does not fear before God. See, there's a contrast here between living life under the sun in a way that just focuses on that which is evil and sees how terrible that evil is and how unfair everything is, versus living by the hand of God, which is a faith response to the evil that is in this world. And it will be well for those who fear God, who have that faithful response. The problem is then repeated in verse 14, the concept that life's often not fair. It just isn't. And so just the prize is to just enjoy it as it is. And we could look back, we're going to see that in chapter 9 and verse 7 in a moment. So keep that in mind. Keep chapter 8 if you're taking notes. Write down chapter 8 and verse 15 and that concept and link it to chapter 9 and verse 7. Life is often not fair. But you see, living life for God is not about life being fair. It's about living it by his hand. And so just enjoy it as it is. We could think of different little sayings that we have, bloom where you're planted, and those kinds of things. Those are the concepts. That's what we're dealing with. Life's enigma. The enigma of life is that there's actually vanity and wisdom. Let's pick up here in verse, picking up in verse 16. When I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, even though one sees no sleep day or night, then I saw all the work of God, that a man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. For though a man labors to discover it, yet he will not find it. Moreover, though a wise man attempts to know it, he will not be able to find it. For I considered, chapter 9 and verse 1, all this in my heart, so that I could declare it all, that the righteous and the wise and their works are in the hand of God. People know neither love nor hatred by anything they see before them. The righteous and the wise and their works are in the hand of God. See, I sought to understand. I sought to see it. I tried to apply my heart to know wisdom and to see the business of what is done. And I lost sleep over it. But man cannot find out. We don't know. And so life's enigma is that even wisdom can be empty and vain. We cannot sustain and have the life that we need on the basis of earthly wisdom. The wisdom that counts is the fear of the Lord and the trusting in him. Because God's work is glorious. Nobody knows God's work. Nobody understands everything that God's doing. Nobody but God knows. Neither justice nor wisdom guarantee tranquility. You see, life is often not fair, but if we remember it's all in God's hands, then we can enjoy it as it is and serve him, trusting him, not seeking fulfillment in life through fairness, through justice, through wisdom in terms of how we're treated or what we know. Those don't guarantee tranquility. Only a trust in God can provide us the calm that we need as we face life's challenges. And then death's sting. You might immediately, when you see death's sting there, some of you may immediately go to 1 1 Corinthians chapter 15, oh, death, where's your victory, right? And those concepts. And that's perfectly okay. See, human nature's problems are universal. Sin is universal among the sons of men. But it's a heart problem. It's an all-encompassing problem. And death's punch comes to us all. There's a judgment. There's an eternity. Death's punch hits us all. Thank goodness, as Paul's point is in 1 Corinthians 15, which we referenced a minute ago, in Christ, death loses that sting. But from the standpoint of what we're reading in Ecclesiastes, and the point of Ecclesiastes is, it doesn't matter how wise you are, it doesn't matter how much fairness you seek in how people treat you, it doesn't matter how much you long for justice, death still comes. And so the only solution ultimately is to trust God. Hope and faith. Trust Him and hope and faith. Where there is life, there is hope. In verses 7 through 10 of chapter 9, we have some discussion about that faith. Let's read those. Go eat your bread with joy, and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already accepted your works. Let your garments always be white, and let your head lack no oil. Live joyfully with a wife whom you love all the days of your vain or empty life, which He has given you under the sun, all your days of emptiness, vanity, for that is your portion in life, and in the labor which you perform under the sun. In other words, none of it amounts to anything in this life. But as we've already seen in Ecclesiastes, the only way it amounts to anything, the only way any of it means anything, is if we live it in faith in Him, so that the things that we're doing have an impact in the lives of others. So that the things that we do display a hope that is rooted in our faith in Him. Living by the hand of God has its benefits. I want you to think about how this is chapter 8 and verse 15 actually being lived out. Let's read 8:15 again. So I commended enjoyment, because a man has nothing better under the sun than to eat, drink, and be merry. For this will remain with him in his labor all the days of his life, which God gives him under the sun. Now, if we pull this out of context, it would be easy to think of it as saying, anything goes. Laissez le bon temps rouler. Let the good times roll, right? Nothing matters. We're all going to die anyway, so let's just live it up. But in context, he's not saying that the way the world says that. The context is what you have and who you are is by the hand of God. So enjoy it. But the only way to enjoy it is to remember that it's by the hand of God. To remember that it is a trust from Him. And that my hope cannot be in those things. My hope has to be in my faith in the one who has put me in the circumstances that I have and given me the things that He has given me. Regardless of what that is. It's easy for us to look at others and say, and be envious. Right? But there's always somebody else looking at us with that envy as well. There's somebody else in the world that looks at us and we have situations or circumstances that they just wish they could have that. That's one of the truths of life. And so, where there's life, there is hope if life is lived by the hand of God. Living by the hand of God has its benefits. In John chapter 10 and verse 10, Jesus talks about that abundant life. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. You see, one can live and enjoy life, a satisfied and fulfilled life, a life that is comfortable, regardless of our actual circumstances. Some of us, some of you, have been places where you thought, man, I don't know how those people live that's a miserable way to live. But when you spend some time with them, you realize that they're comfortable with that. They're fine because they're living by the hand of God. One can live and enjoy life satisfied, fulfilled, comfortable, accompanied, but not if one's satisfaction and fulfillment and comfort is rooted in the things under the sun. You see, that satisfaction, fulfillment, and comfort can only come by a hope rooted in faith in the one who provides, the one who has entrusted. So make the most of it. Hope and faith. So there's authority and justice and faithfulness as we move on to wisdom and foolishness. Wisdom and foolishness. Chapter 9, 11. Wisdom. There's some interesting things here in chapter 9, beginning in verse 11. There are no certainties, right? Time and chance play a role, and man can't really make any of it happen long term the way he wants it to. Timing and chance play their role. And as you read verses 11 and 12, you can see the picture that is being painted there in that regard. Timing and chance play their role. A little luck goes a long way. And the truth of the matter is that time is in God's hands. We all know that we can take all the necessary precautions, we can make all the necessary plans, but circumstances beyond our control play an important role in life's accomplishments. And so if we set our hope in our ability to plan, in our ability to take precautions, in our ability to do this or that, we're doomed to disappointment. Not just because we're going to fail and we're going to make mistakes, but because there are things that happen in life that are beyond our control, and the only solution, the only answer to that problem is to live by the hand of God and have our hope and our faith in Him. Time and chance. There's even unknown wisdom in this world. In verses 13 to 16, we see some discussion about oppression by a great king and how that oppression, in fact, can be a good thing, even though it may not be a pleasant thing. In verse 15, we have a scene where this poor man, the implication is this nobody, the wisdom of this nobody saves a city. But guess what? Wisdom's good, but don't expect recognition. Time passes and nobody remembers that wise nobody in town whose wisdom saved the city. So wisdom can come from all kinds of places, but we still can't depend on it for the satisfaction that we need in life. It's good, but don't expect recognition. In verses 17 through the first verse of chapter 10, we have that frustrated wisdom. Though wisdom has its advantages over power, it still has one weakness, and that is it being ignored. This draws back from verse 15 moving forward. And we know also, and we have this concept here as we get into chapter 10 and verse 1. Let's actually read from verse 18 of chapter 9. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys so much good. Dead flies putrefy the perfumer's ointment and cause it to give off a foul odor. So does a little folly to one respected for wisdom and honor. So the idea is a little bad sure can ruin a lot of good, and even the wisest of wise do some foolish things at times, and those foolish things can really mess up and frustrate wisdom. And so then that transitions into the foolishness beginning in chapter 10 and verse 2. We read that foolishness can't hide. There's no hiding it. We know this to be true. Foolishness tends to be quite obvious. Foolishness happens even in high positions. Verses 4 through 7. And it just does. And then in verses 8 through 11, we see some foolishness in action. Even common action can be disastrous for a fool, verses 8 and 9. The idea, a couple of examples there, and that is something that should be simple, but the fool still falls in the pit, right? Or the fool is dealing with a wall and gets bit by a snake, right? Fool digs a pit, falls into it, breaks through a wall, and is bitten by a snake. Foolishness in action. Even common action can be disastrous for a fool. In verses 10, we have the fool doesn't prepare, so his tools are dull, and so he's got to work harder because he didn't prepare. And then in verse 11, we see that the fool's problem is that he does entirely too much talking and entirely not enough doing. And then that transitions into verses 12 through 14, that babbling concept in verse 10 moves forward. In verse 11, the babbler is no different than the words of a wise man, verse 12, a wise man's mouth are gracious, but the lips of a fool shall swallow him up, because he talks a lot. The words of his mouth begin, verse 13, with foolishness, and the end of his talk is raving madness. A fool also multiplies words. No man knows what is to be. Who can tell him what will be after him? Fool's words. Fool's words. The words of a fool have an effect on his reputation. We saw that in verse 3. In verse 13. They have an effect on his character. You can think about what James writes in James chapter 3 and verse 6. And how that loose tongue can have such a tremendous impact, which then links back to the concepts that we just saw back at the end of chapter 9 and beginning of chapter 10, of the fact that a little goes a long way. A little bad sure can ruin a lot of good. A fool's words have an effect on his potential. A fool's words have an effect on his judgment. And let's think about how he's talking about foolishness. Because we can pull this out of context and we can think of it as a contrast between wisdom and foolishness as we think in this world of wisdom and foolishness. But how does he define wisdom? The wisdom that he's talking about is about living by the hand of God. And so the foolishness is about not living by the hand of God. So these things that he's talking about relate to that concept of wisdom and foolishness. In verse 13, we see the magnification of the fool's foolishness by the many words that he uses. And also in verse 14, we see his arrogance evident and shown in the many words. We also see the fool's, there's the fool's words. We also see the fool's lazy incompetence in verse 15. The labor of fools wearies them, for they don't even know how to go to the city because of that laziness. And we're going to see that laziness come back into play in the next context, which deals with kind of a national foolishness. We're going to read here, let's pick back up in verse 15, and we're going to read down through verse 20. The labor of fools wearies them, for they do not even know how to go to the city. Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child, and your princes feast in the morning. Blessed are you, O land, when your king is the son of nobles, and your princes feast at the proper time, for strength and not for drunkenness. Because of laziness, the building decays, and through idleness of hands, the house leaks. A feast is made for laughter, and wine makes merry, but money answers everything. Do not curse the king, even in your thought. Do not curse the rich, even in your bedroom. For a bird of the air may carry your voice, and a bird in flight may tell the matter. So what do we see? We see a foolish path and a wise path in verses 16 and 17. The foolish path when your king is a child, or your translation may say a servant. The idea is your king is a nobody, one who's not wise. Your princes feast in the morning, and because of laziness or through idleness of hands, things are the way they are. And in the wise path, your king is the son of nobles. Your princes feast at the proper time. Your princes feast for strength and not for drunkenness. But there in verse 19, we have this idea that this contrast of 18 and 19, laziness, right? Because of laziness, the building decays, and through idleness of hands, the house leaks. So even amongst the national leadership, you have a scene where the house is leaking, the house is falling apart, everything's falling apart, and they're too lazy to do anything about it. And yet, verse 19, they have enough time and energy to feast and laugh and drink and have a mentality of, that's all right, money will solve the problems. We can handle it. Money's the answer to everything, isn't it? But that concept in and of itself, money being the answer, we can solve it with money, is inherently a concept that is not living by the hand of God. And then he closes in verse 20, or that little piece closes with this statement of don't curse the king even in your thought, do not curse the rich even in your bedroom, for a bird of the air may carry your voice, and a bird in flight may tell the matter. The idea is don't dare criticize. The fool is going to be a fool even in the highest of positions. The fool is going to be a fool even in terms of the nation. But my goodness, you better not say anything about it, because word will get to them. Don't dare criticize. That brings us to the end of chapter 10. And before we actually move in through the rest of this, we're actually going to read, I'm going to read chapters 11 and 12. They're pretty short, but this is where things really start to wrap up, and the writer is calling his reader to a choice. Chapter 11 and verse 1, cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give us a serving to 7 and also to 8, for you do not know what evil will be on the earth. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth, and if a tree falls to the south or the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it shall lie. He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. As you do not know what is the way of the wind, or how the bones grow in the womb of her who is with child, so you do not know the works of God who makes everything. In the morning sow your seed, and in the evening do not withhold your hand. For you do not know which will prosper, either this or that, or whether both alike will be good. Truly the light is sweet, and is pleasant for the eyes to behold the sun. But if a man lives many years and rejoices in them all, yet let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. All that is coming is vanity, emptiness, meaningless. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes, but know that for all these God will bring you into judgment. Therefore remove sorrow from your heart and put away evil from your flesh, for childhood and youth are emptiness, they're meaningless, fleeting. Remember now your Creator in the days of your youth, before the difficult days come, and the years draw near when you say, I have no pleasure in them. While the sun and the light, the moon and the stars are not darkened, and the clouds do not return after the rain. In the day when the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men bow down, when the grinders cease because they are few, and those that look through the windows grow dim. When the doors are shut in the streets, and the sound of grinding is low, when one rises up at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of music are brought low. Also they are afraid of height and of terrors in the way. When the almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper is a burden, and desire fails. For man goes to his eternal home, and the mourners go about the streets. Remember your Creator before the silver cord is loosed, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the well. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. All is vanity. And moreover, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. Yes, he pondered and sought out and set in order many proverbs. The preacher sought to find acceptable words, and what was written was upright words of truth. The words of the wise are like goads, and the words of scholars are like well-driven nails, given by one shepherd. And further, my son, be admonished by these. Of making many books there is no end, and much study is wearisome to the flesh. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God, and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. I wanted to read those last two chapters, and now we'll kind of talk through those. There's a call to choice, a call to follow a path of faith. A call to follow a path of faith. This path of faith requires patience. It requires enthusiasm. It requires conformity. It requires that we have priorities and that we have consistency as we approach our choices in life. This path of faith requires a complete confidence. Chapter 11 and verse 5, you don't know. You don't understand. And so, since you don't know how God operates, verse 6, just take care of your business, right? Just keep on keeping on. Sow your seed in the morning, sow it in the evening. You don't know how it's going to go, so just keep on doing. This path of faith requires that kind of confidence and that kind of dedication and work. The one who lives by the hand of God finds his or her motivation for life and labor in knowing that God is watching over, even though he or she may not know God's plan and may not even see the results. There's a call to a choice, to follow a path of faith, to live a joyful life, to see the pleasant side of life. And then there's this kind of warning that there's a concept of urgency in living a joyful life, because it gets harder to do so. Life starts throwing other problems at you, physical problems, health problems, whatever. And he goes through a list of things, right, of things that can bring about darkness. Talks about death as one of them. Our lives pass from life into dark, from light into darkness. And so enjoy what God has blessed us with now. We know not what tomorrow holds, and we have no way of living in yesterday. The only thing we can do with yesterday is look back on it, learn from it, and perhaps experience some regret or some happiness as we look at it. And so we've got to live today. We've got to see it as urgent that we live by the hand of God today. That we live a joyful life that can only be attained by living by the hand of God. Because life's struggles, trials, and emptiness will continue. Remember that everything under the sun is empty. Life is uncertain. Nobody knows what's coming next. We just don't. So live your life for Him. Because if we live our lives only for their own pleasures, that's foolish and futile. It is an urgent thing that we make that choice and that we live accordingly. There's a call to rejoice. There are positive attitudes that are called for, an attitude of joy, an attitude of enjoying the pleasures of this life, and taking care of the way of one's heart, and being motivated by the fact that God will take care of things, but God will also take care of me. But that also means that God will also take care of me when I need to be corrected. Childhood and youth are vanity if they are not used to live by the hand of God. Remember now your Creator in the days of your youth, before it's too late, before the bad days get here, before darkness comes, before the silver cord is loosed. Remember your Creator. If a man lives, verse 8, many years and rejoices in them all, yet let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. All that is coming is emptiness. And then we have this epilogue in verses 9 through 14, which we've already read, in which we have the preacher's experience and his effort. He taught, he pondered, he sought, he wrote, he verified, he gave his advice, he gave his warnings. And then verses 13 and 14 give us that kind of summary conclusion of what the point is. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. We live in a world on the brink. Man goes around in circles without a defined path. His only goal is to live life to the max. Man will continue, however, to live frustrated as long as his life has no purpose. And there is no purpose without God. Without God, nothing in this world makes good sense. The futility of this life is not simply an observation, but a reality that fills society if we live this life without God. There's no way out. There's nothing created that can answer some of the questions that life poses. And so we have to trust. And Ecclesiastes was written to just such a society. The preacher has some things to say on the matter. He doesn't come along with intricate philosophies or confusing concepts. He comes along with wisdom from on high. The book is a message from God. He doesn't come with eloquent words, but in simplicity and with a desire to be understood. He doesn't come with a series of arguments to prove God's existence. He goes right to the point and answers life's most important questions. Can one withstand life's hits without any idea of where life is leading? Can one answer all of life's enigmas? Is there any hope in any age's philosophical explanations? Nature doesn't have the answers. History doesn't have the answers. We don't much like to think about death. Nevertheless, death is the most certain thing about life. And so what if, according to the preacher, things are actually totally different than we perceive them? What if this world is not the end of it all? What if God really does exist? What if he rewards those who seek him? What if one of his traits is incredible generosity? Could it be, asks the preacher, that the pointlessness of man's life is rooted actually in man's unwillingness to see God in this way? You see, the purpose and joy of life is rooted in life under the sun, rooted in living life under the sun for the one who created it, living it by the hand of God. That's what gives life purpose. Living by the hand of God is about fearing him and keeping his commandments. The preacher who lived and experienced all of life's pleasures, all of life's paths, all of life's wisdom, tells us this is man's whole duty, to fear God and keep his commandments. May we strive every day to live this life under the sun by the hand of God. Our hope does not come from our health. Our hope does not come from our physical resources. Our hope is not rooted in how clever we are or how wise we are by the standards of this world, how smart we are, what kind of learning we have, our circumstances, none of that. Our hope must be rooted in the hand of God. And our wisdom must be about fearing him and living our lives with a desire to please him. Leave the results and the provision to God. He can take care of everything. Just focus on serving him. Thank you. I hope you've benefited from our study of Ecclesiastes.